The second coming. Turning and turning in the widening gyre. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it, real shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know the 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. So this is William Butler Yeats, wrote it in 1919. That's the question we're asking ourselves at the moment, that's for sure.
What's the future?
What we make of it. With all our unconscious hopes of catastrophe and death, and all our desire to be punished for our sins, or toying with nuclear war. So the first question might be, I suppose, that we could address is something like, what do we mean by civilization anyways?
Yeah.
And I was thinking, at least in part, of the relationship between map and territory, which is a very interesting thing to be looking at in Jerusalem, because the war between all sorts of different maps for the same territory just rages continually there.
Yeah.
Makes for a very intense place. And so the map is the structure of knowledge that makes the underlying territory habitable in some sense, but that would be the conceptual part of it. So the map would be part of civilization, and then the joint direction undertaken with the map would be the other part of civilization in some sense, right? So that would be a pattern of perception, joint perception,
Yeah.
and a pattern of shared action.
Right. Yeah. A pattern of shared action. Often there's also the idea of at least there has to be something that joins it together, so we can perceive that this is this thing, that this is that this space isn't just a vague space, that it actually is something that holds together in a direction. So it can be a shared origin, it can be a shared something that happened that brought different peoples together. It can be a war, like in Greece, it's the Trojan War, which is the beginning of Hellenic culture in some ways, because this war forced the Greeks to join together for a common goal. And although it has its tragedy and it has its scandals, it becomes the source of them recognizing each other as being
bonded.
Yeah.
Right, and so they're bonded in unity by a common
enemy,
common problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so they fall into a narrative right there, and the narrative is good bonded together against evil, something like that, or order bonded together against chaos.
Yeah.
And those narratives can lay on top of each other too. So.
And the question is, what are the best bonds for civilization? And that's always the issue. And I guess that's one of the issues that the West has been asking itself from the time of the Greeks into the time of the Romans and into its Christian history. What's the best source for bonding?
Well, so the first thing we might point out is that if the purpose is to bond, then you could think about that psychologically and sociologically. So let's start psychologically. If your perceptions aren't bonded, then they're incoherent. Right? If they're not unified in some sense, they're incoherent. If they exist in mutual contradiction with one another, then you're a house divided amongst itself. And the reason you can't stand, let's say, is because you're anxious in a house divided amongst itself.
Yeah.
Because anxiety actually signals lack of coherence. It signals entropy. It signals too much information. And so you have to have a unity of perception to perceive anything. And then you have to have an overarching unity of perception to bring all the perceptions together so that your worldview isn't fragmented. And we've been talking about the fact that that unity of perception requires something like a center. And then for people to live peacefully together, there has to be a unity as well of perception, as all of the things that we talk about refer to perceptions as their axioms in some sense. So there has to be a unity of perception.
And there has to be, the reason why it has to be a center is because there's another danger, right? There's the other danger besides the loose anarchy upon the world, which is something like uniformity. So you can have, and we've seen in the 20th century, systems or governments that impose
too much
uniformity.
Order.
And so China is an example where everybody dresses the same, everybody has the same size of house, everybody has the same. And so what a center does is it creates a point, common point, where we all recognize this to be what binds us, but then we can also recognize the difference. So you can have, let's say in Western civilization, you could have, right, the Germans, the French, the English, you can have these different nationalities, but they were at least bound to some extent in their common value, or it's more than value, their common participation in a story. And in the case of Jerusalem,
yeah, well, there might be no difference between value and participation in a story, right?
Well, it's just that in the modern world, we have this idea of value as these abstract things that we follow, these abstract moral codes.
Right, but that's so strange that it's abstract, because a value implies emotion. If something's valuable, it's better, it's more worthwhile, it's more pleasing, it inspires hope, it establishes order. The better is an emotional judgment in some sense, and all those emotions are predicated on action. Like all emotion grows out of action. All positive emotion is forward action. All negative emotion is freezing or retreating. So
it can help you understand why things lay themselves out the way they do, which is that we remember history and remember civilization through people, through figures, but we don't necessarily remember things just for their abstract morality. So we have a sense those people have brought us certain virtues that we can embody, but that we see in them the virtue, right? They don't just say it, they manifest it. You know, and so it's like, even in the United States, for example, you do have the Constitution, you have the documents, but you have figures like George Washington that, you know, that embodied a certain sense of virtue that people see as an example. And without that, it also doesn't work. And so this is where Western civilization is also Western history. It has to be history in the sense that it is a connection of people, one with, one following each other, that followed in the footsteps of the others. And recognizing...
That's a pattern of shared mimicry.
Exactly. And there's a way in which ancient civilization, or ancient Western civilization, was able to both recognize the value of the people they followed and the sins. So there's a tradition, for example, in the European Middle Ages that was called the Nine Worthies. And it was just a remembrance and a celebration of these 9 worthy characters, 3 pagans, 3 Jewish leaders, and then 3 Christian leaders. And when they described the leaders, it was like Alexander and Joshua and all these figures that were civil figures. But every description you read of them, you would read a description where it says, this is why we admire this person, this is what they did, and this is their sins. Like, this is where they fell short. So there's a capacity to...
So that's an intelligent reading of history that separates the wheat from the chaff and doesn't call all the wheat chaff, or vice versa.
Because now we're in this radical problem where it's as if anybody has any sin in their past. And of course, the difficulty with great men is when they do great things, they often also do horrible things. Like that happens, especially if you're dealing with wars and you're dealing with all these difficulties. And so there's a way in which now, as soon as we see the sin of someone in the past, we just throw them out.
Or the present.
Or the present, yeah. We just throw them out as if we didn't have any sins.
Yeah, exactly, as if that.
As if we didn't have any sins at the scale that we do, that we live, you know? It's like you're not in a position, let's say, where you can have a great effect on the world. And so your sins will look smaller, but usually they're as big as they are at the level that you live.
Or bigger.
Or sometimes bigger.
Yeah.
Correct.
Your incompetent inability to scale your sin is not an index of your moral virtue.
Yeah.
You know, these students who pull down representations of people like Francis Galton think, well, that's a pretty easy way to be morally superior to Francis Galton. It's like, good luck with that. And to pull down all the great men of the past in that manner, to think you're not simultaneously pulling yourself down. Or what is it that you represent that's so virtuous in contrast to the greatness of the past? What is the presumption you're making under those circumstances? A pure sinlessness on your part that is now bound in this moment, omniscient in some manner, that vision has never been able to embody in the past and in your form.
But it's a revolutionary way of thinking, right? It's a way of thinking which projects into the future, virtue into the future. It's almost like we'll get rid of our history, we'll destroy everything, and then what will come out of that will be some kind of utopia.
Yeah, and that's based on that idea too, that it's a warped version of Rousseau and the noble savage ideas that human beings are basically good, except insofar as social structures make them evil. And that is so preposterously naive and narcissistic simultaneously that it's almost beyond imagining.
And I think it's important to understand if you understand, let's say, the root of Western civilization, how it works, and you can recognize some of these stories, like Marxism, like Rousseau, as these parasites or these twisted versions of the Christian story, for example. So obviously Rousseau is like a twisted version of the fall. It's this strange idea that there was an original point of innocence, and we've fallen from that point of innocence, but now brought into...
But what made us fall was society.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Right, there's no serpent in that story, or the serpent and society are conflated.
And there isn't a sense in which there's the sin. Like in the garden, it's not the serpent that sins, it's Adam and Eve that sin, So the temptation might come from the serpent, but they're the ones that take the bite, they're the ones that move. And so there's a sense in which it's not as simple as something that Rousseau is setting up. And we know that what Rousseau said just isn't true. As soon as you're in contact with people that have more simple societies, you'll see that violence is as real. It's not scaled. It's not as scaled, of course, but it's
the homicide rate in hunter-gatherer tribes is way higher than it is in
sure.
civilized world. Because they don't have any mechanisms to adjudicate conflict between adults.
Yeah, and that could be an interesting definition of civilization, and you see that both in the Greek story and in the Bible. In the Greek story, you have the whole story of the Eumenides, where this chaos of incest and of murder gets so complicated that at some point there's no way to sort it out. It's like the son kills his mother because his mother killed his father, and then he killed their daughter. It's like all this interfamilial madness that now even the sense of just revenge can't even function, because it's like, if I'm going to kill my mother because she killed my father out of revenge, it's like I'm self-destroying, I'm self-eating. And the solution to that was the Athenian court system.
Yeah.
And you see the
same...
same...
that seems highly probable, because it is the case that, anthropologists have wondered for a long time why human society appeared to, in some sense, stagnate for 350,000 years. Because in principle, genetically, we attained our current form 350,000 years ago, but we didn't make a hell of a lot of progress. And it could be that pre-existent tit-for-tat, revenge-cycled madness kept us down on a permanent basis. We weren't able to build those intermediary structures to adjudicate conflict.
And so you see the same story in the Exodus story, right? You have this, in the Exodus story, it's mostly represented as this fire, right? The fire of God that is consuming. It's It's almost in the opposite of the Greek story, where now it's not the chaos down here, is that the ideal is too high. Right? It'll consume you. You can't, it's too high, you can't embody it. And so you have to have these mediating structures, the law, the structure of leadership, in order to mediate your high ideal and its incarnation. So that could be an interesting definition of civilization itself, and how.
So well, you could think then too that the structure of civilization is the differentiation of Jacob's ladder.
Yeah.
Right, and this makes sense too. So, I was reading some papers by some people influenced by Carl Friston, who's a great neuroscientist, and his conception of conception and perception, which is akin to the one that I developed in Maps of Meaning, is that perception is a structure of hierarchical categories. And what a category does is reduces a set of almost infinitely complex phenomena to something like a single conception, a single functional conception.
Yeah.
Because it's not a mere description. So, glass, cup. Well, it's a very complicated object. It's full of reflections. It's different in an infinite number of ways from this cup, not least by its localization. You know how different it was if you tried to paint both of them side by side.
Yeah.
And so, but there's something that binds this, and part of it is its functional utility, so I can pick it up. Part of it is its actual physical coherence. The functional element is the functional element of it is that I can use it to drink from, and that's so a singular purpose. And so in some sense, a concept is a map of a part of a complex underlying reality, territory, that reduces that territory to a single functional actuality. And then the whole structure of conception is a hierarchy of categories, and each category constrains a chunk of infinite complexity.
Yeah.
And that provides for psychological stability. And that's not exactly a theory. It looks like that's how conceptual systems work. It looks like that's how AI systems work. And they're hierarchical because, well, this cup is on a table. And so what's the table? Well, a table is, you could think about it as the object table, but a table is more particularly a place where you can sit with others to share food. And that's the more basic definition of table than rectangular plane with supporting legs, even though that's part of it. And then the table is part of the restaurant, and the restaurant is part of the neighborhood, and the neighborhood is part of the city. And you can think about those as descriptions, but they're not, because the restaurant is a place of function, and the neighborhood is a place where people live, and the city is an aggregate of neighborhoods. And so it's not an objective description exactly. It's a hierarchy of functional percept. And then that scales all the way up. So you could think above the city is the state, above the state is the nation. You might think that you live to serve the nation, but then you might ask, well, what principle do nations exist to serve?
Yeah.
Right, and then you start moving beyond the local, in some sense, into the eternal and the transcendent. And that gets us back to the problem of the center, is what center point must there be around which nations necessarily aggregate themselves?
Yeah.
And we saw that today as we walked through the Via Dolorosa and into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. At least we saw the Christian answer to that question.
So when we did our dinner in Bethlehem, near Bethlehem, we were in a small restaurant, and at some point during the dinner, we started to hear noise. There were ambulance noises or police noises, sirens, people screaming in the street. And we later found out that there was a serious disturbance that happened. There had been some people throwing rocks, police shot a young person, and then a riot erupted. It was really a testimony to see just how difficult the situation is in that area and just how tense it was. And that tension followed us, I would say, all through the trip, too. You know, it was during the Feast of the Tabernacles, and so we could see these little huts outside the city. And there was one evening when we were coming back from Tel Aviv where our taxi driver told us that he couldn't go to the hotel straightforwardly, had to take a detour, and we're trying to look. And then all of a sudden we see these cocktail Molotovs erupting, in the distance. And as I came to my hotel and I walked up to the floor, I looked out the window and I saw this confrontation in the street just in front of me of, on the one hand, Palestinian youth throwing rocks, and then Israeli youth just chasing them down. And there was this confrontation in the street, and it really, was a reminder of how tense and how difficult the situation is in the Holy Land. What's interesting about the Christian center is, for example, in Delphi there was an umbilicus mundi, right? There was a belly button of the world.
Yeah.
And it was
Omphalos, right?
Yeah. There was a stone, right, that's it, like this is the center. And then from there, you measure difference from that point, right? You measure strangeness from that point. And the Romans had a similar place in Rome that was the center, and they calculated the roads from that center. So like the distance that, if you've talked about the distance of the road, was also related to this one center. And so what you can see that happens is that as time progresses, these centers become also more encompassing. So you can imagine, it was fractal already at that time, because in a home, in a Greek home, they had a hearth, and that hearth acted as, it's a heart. It was the heart of the house. And then that would scale into the belly button for the Greeks. But it's also...
there's always the center point.
But it's still, like, how can I say that? There's something that is quite tribal about it. Yeah. Right? It still has this really tribal element. And so what you see with monotheism is that it starts to scale.
Well, what you could say, so imagine so each tribe is organized around a center. Mircea Eliade documents that very, very carefully across cultures, that there's always a center point that defines the essence of the tribe in some sense. So then you imagine that, you have a lot of different tribes. Okay, so the first thing to note there is you have a lot of different tribes. So what you're saying is you have a lot of different things that are the same. Okay, so why are they the same? Well, in part because they're all organized around a center.
That's right. That's
okay, so then you might say, okay, what do all those centers have in common, if anything? And the answer might be, well, once tribes start coming together, one of the things they're trying to sort out is, what is the commonality of the center?
Yeah.
So then you could imagine 100 tribes grouping into 10, producing 10 meta-centers, and then you could imagine those 10 grouped together, coming together to produce one quasi-nation, and then all those meta-centers being aggregated into an even more abstract center. And then you can imagine that iterating across time until the concept of the center becomes more and more differentiated and also more and more universalized. And what we saw today, especially in the last room in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, was that cross made out of a piece of the true cross, embedded inside a larger cross, embedded inside an icon, with the structure of Western civilization iconically represented behind it. And so that's a stacking of centers. Yeah. And the cross marks the center. And so then the question is, what's at the center? And that was what we tried to explore today by walking down the Via Dolorosa. The center is something like the willingness to voluntarily encounter the utter mortal catastrophe of life and to shoulder it. That's the center of everything. It has to be the center of everything, because that would be the truest manifestation of the human spirit.
You can also see it, because one of the aspects of traditional centers of many civilizations had to do with sacrifice. There was a sense in which, for example, so in the Hebrew temple, there was the place for sacrifice, and there was the place where, say, the seat of God was, and that God would descend and manifest himself on the seat of God. So you would offer up things up to the heaven, and that would bind you, because it was
also things you valued.
It was also a meal, by the way. People always forget that the sacrifice of the animals was something that you would sacrifice, and then you would eat. So your family would bring a sacrifice, offer it up, and then you eat it together. So it becomes, it's like the ultimate family meal, you could say, where it's like we sit together.
The ultimate family meal is a proper sacrifice to God.
Well, that's why, I mean, Thanksgiving is a remainder of that in U.S. culture, where it's like we come together to give thanks, to pray, and that also binds our family together.
So we come together while we're looking up to the highest point.
That's the good way to
and so that's an establishment of Jacob's ladder.
Yes.
In the midst of the table.
And so
and then you say, well, I was thinking about this in terms of veganism and vegetarianism. I think part of the reason that people are so guilty about what they eat now is because they don't sacrifice it to a sufficiently high purpose. And you might say, well, why should an animal die so that I should live? And that's actually a real question.
Yeah.
And I think maybe it's a question that everybody has to answer or feel profoundly disturbed in their unconscious orientation and then suffering as a consequence of it. And so if it's not consecrated, if what you're sacrificing that's alive isn't consecrated to something like a transcendent, the highest possible transcendent aim, then there's no justification in taking the blood.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm nervous about that conceptualization to some degree because it sounds like a ends justify the means argument, but
it's important. But in terms, I mean, I don't know about the veganism question, but in terms of understanding sacrifice, it's important to see what happens. And one of the things that, let's say, the meeting of Athens and Jerusalem does in the foundation of Christianity is to reveal the notion that the best sacrifice is giving yourself.
Yeah.
That's the best sacrifice. So you can think about it, right? In a family, you can have a scapegoat. It works, right? You can have if you have a family of 5, you can have one of the kids who's always the one doing the wrong thing. You blame everything on that person, and it actually binds you together. Like if you find someone to, like, a group of young boys find the one boy that gets picked on.
Yeah.
And that works. It binds the group together, but it's not the best way to bind. And what seems to be revealed...
It's because all the sin is externalized.
That's right. And it seems like the idea of saying, no, I give myself to this group. Yeah. That's the best, that seems to be the highest sacrifice.
Well, I think what we saw today, so with the stations of the Via Dolorosa, the stations of the cross, what you see when people act that out and contemplate it is a journey through the realms of human suffering. And so then the question might be, well, why would you do that? Or why should you do that even? And then why would that be a uniting phenomenon?
That's right.
And so you should do it from the psychological perspective because it appears that the best way to put the best foot forward is to voluntarily confront those things that you're afraid of and that disgust you, that stand in your way. And a century of clinical endeavor has culminated in that as, I would say, a universal axiom of successful psychotherapy. It's voluntary exposure.
Yeah.
It has to be voluntary exposure, augmented by voluntary attention. So the more intense the attention, the more real the encounter with that which is feared and avoided, the more curative the result, quite counterintuitively. And the reason for that, as far as I can tell, fundamentally, is that there's no difference between that and learning. Because when you learn, what you do is you put yourself on the border of order and chaos. And this has all been mapped out quite nicely now neurophysiologically. The order is the conceptual scheme that you're already using to bind the world. And the chaos is everything that exists beyond that conceptual scheme, which would include to some degree the future, because the future has this novel element, because the future is not encapsulated yet in the conceptual scheme and can't be, because it's technically
still potential.
Yes, and it's not a deterministic potential either, at least not entirely.
Yeah.
And so what you do when you learn is you put yourself on the edge optimally, and then you incorporate something new, like a new fruit, and you let something that's not sufficiently meet, not sufficiently appropriate, die as a consequence. And so in that sense, learning means you have to sacrifice your ignorance and your pride in an optimized manner. And if you do that properly, then it's actually enjoyable. It's engaging and meaningful and playful and all those things. And there's a deep instinct that signifies that. But it's a sacrificial act because you have to let the elements of yourself, which are really like sub-personalities, these functional conceptions, you have to let them die. And there's some pain associated with that. And that's part of the process of optimizing death on the psychological and psychophysiological front, so that you stay healthy and adapted, and so that you don't actually die by acting out your mistakes. Yeah. And so that idea of so that would be like the sacrifice of sin.
So there are two sacrifices, right? So in the Jewish tradition, at Yom Kippur, there are two sacrifices. And this is actually, I think, I've been thinking about this in terms of understanding the problem of coherence. Even whether it's in your person, or whether it's a conceptual category, whether it is a society, there is a realizing that which doesn't fit and then kind of pushing it out. That's the scapegoat sacrifice. So during Yom Kippur, they would take a goat and they would put the sins of other people on the goat. They would chase it out into the desert for it to die. It was given to a demon.
Right. That's to obliterate the anomalous.
Yeah.
Right. Rather than to incorporate it.
And then there was another sacrifice, which another goat was taken and then was given up to God. And then so that was the sacrifice up. So you can imagine that if you're part of a basketball team, you have to give yourself up to the purpose of the basketball team, and you also have to eliminate the behavior that doesn't fit.
Yeah, and then you could also imagine, using the basketball analogy, think about that. Think about the game as the what would you call it? It's a fractal form of civilization, a game.
Yeah.
Okay, so the rules of the game aren't there to constrain, they're there to enable.
Yeah.
Now you have to abide by the rules, but the reason for that is the game can't continue without the rules. It's not so that you're constrained. It's actually so that you're freed to play the game. Okay, so then you might say, what principle should you abide by while you're playing the game? And the principle might be, crush your opponent. And then you might ask, well, who's your opponent? And one could be the other team. The other could be, well, also your own teammates, because you want to be the star player.
The best.
And then you might say, well, and what kind of margin of victory do you want to win by? And you might say, well, the largest possible margin of victory. So what you do is you go out as an absolute narcissist. You never pass the ball once. You play people who can't play basketball at all.
Yeah.
So you demolish them. You never pass to your teammates and you score all the baskets. It's like victory, right? Well, in some sense, that is the ultimate local victory. If you constrain the game to a single exemplar, it's like, well, you're the best player on the team and your team crushed your opponents, victory. But then the problem with that conception is that if you're on a basketball team, you don't play a basketball game. You play a whole sequence of basketball games, and you play them with a whole variety of opponents. And the ethos that has to emerge to allow the game to continue, if it iterates across locations, is not the same game that emerges if you only play it once. And that's probably another example of that stacking of centers. So you could say, well, imagine each game, there's a pattern that would enable you to win each game. And to some degree, merely playing for power would enable you to win some. But if you calculate it across a huge set of games, power, it would be some other principle that would arise, which would be something like the principle of voluntary free play is really what it is. It's the antithesis